Hello, I'm Justin Berenbaum, Vice President of Strategy at Exola and GM of Exola Funding Club. Over the course of my 25-plus year career in the video game industry, I've watched great games emerge from every corner of the world on every platform where players gather. Working in strategic development, a lot of my perspective on the video game industry has been shaped by just that, industry. In other words, if you follow the money, or funding, it can help you understand how the current state of video game funding came to be and where it might be headed. By the end of this talk, we want you to understand how far we've come and feel more ready to continue your search for the funding to finish, publish, and market your game. The early days of video games were the kind of free-for-all that makes you wish you could travel back in time to take advantage of. Aside from arcade cabinets, some of the earliest games were largely shared between friends, with ambitious creators using their school or home computers, or even personal calculators in the case of legendary Nintendo CEO Satoru Iwata to create their games. Steve Russell created Space War all the way back in 1962 as an MIT student. Sierra Online founders Ken and Roberta Williams, among many others, pioneered early video game monetization with an entrepreneurial spirit that was largely self-funded. Then consoles changed the game. While arcade and PC games continued to evolve, console manufacturers like Atari, which launched in 1977, and Intellivision in 1979, rapidly entered the mainstream toy market. With their own standalone hardware and proprietary programming, console manufacturers could effectively control which games were created and sold, establishing them as market makers. If you wanted to make a game for the home console market, you either had to work in-house for a company like Atari or Intellivision, or come to them hoping they would bless your idea and not steal it. When the video game market crashed, and it crashed hard in 1983 due to market saturation and the rise of the personal computer, the future of video game funding was uncertain for a time. Of course, all of that changed with the release of Nintendo's Famicom, later brought to North America in 1985 as the Nintendo Entertainment System. With video games safely recovered from the massive crisis, console manufacturers had renewed power. They also had an unprecedented demand. While careful to avoid a glut of lackluster releases like the ones that contributed to the crash of '83, companies like Nintendo gradually began to accept games from more and more third-party publishers. This gave developers a new option for finding funding, even if they still had gatekeepers at the publisher level. Back in the dark ages, there was no digital distribution. Thus, there was a far more powerful gatekeeper that developers had to face: retail. This included retailers themselves, distributors, and even merchandisers who would place the product on store shelves. With minimum order quantities for physical manufacturing starting at 50,000 units, and the cost of goods often up to $30 or more per game, this was an extremely expensive proposition, especially when these costs had to be paid up front. Games not only needed to be great, but also have great and expensive marketing support. These factors kept console manufacturers and publishers risk-averse, making funding for development on new ideas and external IPs very hard to come by. Fortunately for developers, especially PC-first developers, through the early to mid-90s, it was also possible to bootstrap or semi-bootstrap a game. Shareware culture helped developers with enough cash to get started spreading demos until they could either monetize by partnering with a publisher or by evolving into a publisher themselves. id Software famously popularized this practice in 1993 by promoting the first 9 levels of Doom on a set of 2 free 3.5-inch floppy disks, and later a very fancy CD-ROM, with Raven Software following suit in 1994 on Heretic. In fact, if you were gaming in the 90s, you may have fond memories of finding shareware at stores or in magazines. After installing shareware, you could then purchase the full version of the game by credit card over your powerfully loud dial-up modems. Or you could simply share it with a friend. As PC and console hardware became more and more powerful through the so-called console wars of the mid-90s, developers needed more and more money to make their games. The young market was conditioning its still young customers to expect bigger, better, and bolder games. And so, publishers continue to play a huge role in the quest for funding. This pattern pretty much stayed the same through the mid-2000s. Following similar success in other parts of the world, Western PC game sales surged with Steam launching in 2003 and GOG in 2008, and later the Epic Games Store following in 2018 to become indie and even AAA kingmakers. In Steam's early years, competition was low and player consumption was high. Unlike in today's increasingly competitive, community-driven landscape, this meant that many decent games could strike gold, in part by simply showing up. Then there's the free-to-play explosion circa the Great Recession of 2008. While free-to-play games were already a huge phenomenon in Asia and elsewhere, the same historic housing crash that caused financial hardships globally drove many consumers to free-to-play games on Facebook like Farmville and Mafia Wars. From 2008 to around 2012, companies like Zynga and Machine Zone became powerhouses with simple flash games on ever-growing social media sites, while PC gamers found themselves with a barrage of free-to-play shooters and MMOs to try. All this while the iPhone and its App Store quickly switched gears from full price to free-to-play games supported by microtransactions. These were seismic shifts that empowered an entirely new class of indie and mainstream developer. Before this, free-to-play summoned sneers from so-called core gamers. Now it's just another business model most players can't imagine living without as they play games like Call of Duty and Candy Crush on their phones. Then, in the early 2010s, video game funding shifted completely, especially for indie developers. You could even say it was kick-started. While crowdfunding has always existed in various forms, begging your friends and family for cash, branded platforms like Kickstarter and Indiegogo empower developers to pitch their games directly to players and the gaming press. Kickstarter wasn't necessarily a revolution for everyone, and it definitely hasn't guaranteed that funded games actually fulfill their promise or even see release. But its rapid rise still felt like something new. This feeling, combined with the platform's press and social media-friendly functionality and assets, have continued to make it a viable option for many in the indie space. But indie games continue to evolve, and in a wild way. Until now, external gatekeepers, technological advancements, and the economic challenges of scaling a game to profitability were among the biggest factors that drove the evolution of indie games, and in turn, how they got funded. Now more than ever, it's something far more difficult to divide and conquer: the competition. Video games are the biggest thing in entertainment, full stop. Earlier this year, Newzoo reported that the video game business scored $175 billion in 2020, and it expects that figure to rise to $200 billion by 2023. For the first time in history, and this is a little hyperbolic, but not much, every kind of person plays games, at almost every time of day and on one or more devices, including their phones. This became especially apparent last year as more and more cultures around the world began to accept, adopt, and spend on video games in equal measure. Perhaps most prominently, the World Health Organization re-examined the value of video games. Just a year after adding gaming disorder to the list of official diseases in 2019, in a rather amusing about-face, the World Health Organization recommended playing video games to effectively practice social distancing. Last year's video game industry growth was amazing news for many investors, who, according to Forbes, poured more than $13.2 billion into the business. These investors, however, are typically large entities. While the average person can easily invest in public video game companies, there haven't been an abundance of opportunities for people to invest directly in a game or its future revenue. At Exola, we noticed, and we've been working on a way to change that, not only to empower individual investors, but particularly to ensure more great games have more chances to get made and played. Before we can bridge individual investors with indie game funding, we have to understand the rise of indie games and their gradual mutation to more of a genre or an ethos in today's increasingly complex ecosystem. That's the reason we're talking about the history of video game funding today. Traditional funding sources are still there. What's exciting is that indie developers now have so many more options. Indie games, as we come to call them, started out as truly independent creations, usually from either a single creator or a small group of collaborators. As the video game industry has grown, developers with the skills and resources to complete games have had more and more options to partner with investors and publishers, increasing their potential audience and revenue, keeping them competitive long term. Just look at the explosive successes of games like Undertale, Untitled Goose Game, Among Us, Fall Guys, and Rocket League. To the average person, these indie games seem to come out of nowhere. This is proof that fantastic games can, and often do, come from everywhere. That's not to say indie success is assured by any means. While some exceptional games have become hits by word of mouth thanks to a mix of quality, timing, and luck, partnering with investors, publishers, or console makers has usually been par for the course. As with indie music and other mediums in art and entertainment, industry growth has caused the meaning of indie games to evolve. Case in point, AAA games. These games can be as expensive to make and as expensive to market as almost any other game. The difference between a so-called AAA game and a mainstream AAA game can largely be in the eye of the player or the PR firm. Typically, these games are branded as having a singular creative vision and execution, despite the financial support of conventional funding sources. Take-Two Interactive, for one, started its developer-focused publisher, Private Division, in 2017. Since then, Private Division has worked with several development studios to release multiple critically acclaimed and multi-million copy selling games, including The Outer Worlds, Ancestors: The Humankind Odyssey, and the recently announced Kerbal Space Program sequel. And there's still a big middle ground between self-funded indie games and AAA titles, double-I games, if you will. Publishers like Team 17, Versus Evil, Annapurna, Raw Fury, Devolver, 505 Games, and others are creating successful titles across a host of platforms with funding in the range of a few $100,000 to a few $1 million. Indie games and indie developers don't have to be the victim of their own success and mainstreamification. Instead, they simply face new challenges. Players love indie games and are happy to support them. All a developer has to do is reach them. In today's increasingly influencer and streamer-led market, that can require extensive marketing and community building effort. This enhances the need for smart planning and appropriate budgeting. While good games can come from anywhere, indie game funding still tends to come from just a handful of places, including bootstrapping, grants, a limited number of game investors, publishers, and crowdfunding sites. Jonathan Blow self-funded the development of Braid with around $200,000 of his own money. While the game took roughly 3 years to make, it earned $6 million between its release in 2009 and 2015. This allowed him to once again self-fund the creation of Thekla Inc. with $800,000 of his own money to create The Witness. While development costs eventually totaled around $6 million, the game made around $5 million in just its first week and much more thereafter. Toby Fox targeted just $5,000 on the original Undertale Kickstarter in 2013. And while the project earned more than $50,000, Fox was able to use this limited funding to create and release a game that sold more than 1 million copies in its first year and has since earned nearly $27 million on Steam alone. House House's 4-person staff created Untitled Goose Game using, in part, a relatively small amount of public funding from Australia's Victorian state government to release a game that sold well over 1 million copies since 2019 with the help of publisher Panic Inc. While game development costs can vary wildly, now more than ever, indie developers can maximize their game's potential with dedicated funding. So where does that leave the indie game funding ecosystem? On one side, we have developers hungry to make games. On the other, we have individual investors looking to invest. As we've seen, record amounts of investment money has been entering the video game industry. In our conversations with investors, we've learned that even more people are trying to join in. Their only barriers are knowledge and access. How can the industry bridge those two groups for the betterment of all? Enter Exola Game Investment Platform. At Exola, we want to expand the video game investment ecosystem by offering an easier way for accredited investors to fund games with distributed risk, even if they have little or no video game investment experience. This helps more great games get funded, and at Exola, we think the more great games in the world, the better. The platform is built to propel the video game investment world forward by opening the ecosystem to empower multiple qualified co-investors to profit from a single game's revenue. This model helps minimize risk by equipping investors with a portfolio of industry professional vetted projects that they can invest in alongside other qualified co-investors. Like its predecessor, Exola Funding Club, developers can apply to have their games added to the platform. From there, multiple qualified individual investors can search or browse the portfolio for games matching their criteria and make investments in a game's future revenue. Only accredited investors are accepted to the platform, ensuring security and stability for developers. There are other investment services out there, including Republic's Fig, AngelList, and more. Exola Game Investment Platform is different. Investors aren't investing in your studio or your game directly, but rather investing in a game's revenue. At the same time, Exola Game Investment Platform is not a publisher, rather a platform with community features. For example, on Game Investment Platform, investors and developers have profiles that publicly display their success history on the platform. So an investor could be inspired to follow a particularly successful co-investor's lead on a given project. By investing in revenue, investors are able to create a balanced portfolio approach across multiple games and potentially see faster returns. Our frequently updated portfolio will provide plenty of opportunities to review new games at your own pace. This model is ideal for developers who are looking for funding, but aren't necessarily interested in losing any ownership or control of their vision for their game, or the game's intellectual property. So instead of working to compete with other services and funds, Exola Game Investment Platform is meant to further build out the investment ecosystem, inviting everyone to participate. Exola founder and CEO, Shurik Agabitov, breaks down the difference by saying, we don't want to build cars, we want to build roads. That is to say, Exola Game Investment Platform doesn't choose which games on the platform get funded. We simply work to surface games with potential. Developers aren't limited to using Exola Game Investment Platform either, as we actually prioritize getting games in front of publishers and investment groups first through Exola Funding Club, before offering them an additional opportunity on the Game Investment Platform. And this is just the beginning. Exola Game Investment Platform is built with change in mind. Just as indie games and the video game industry as a whole never stop evolving, we're working to stay ahead of the curve to serve developers and investors on their symbiotic funding journeys every step of the way. The more great games that get funded, the better. Thank you for your time. We're excited to welcome developers and investors to Exola Game Investment Platform.